Hi everyone, my name is Jakub Przymaszek. I'm from Azure Databases team. I'm based in Redmond, Washington in the USA. And well, I'm representing team a specific group within Azure Databases, which is security and governance team. We are in general responsible for the internal security of all Azure data services. So we do a lot of things that you don't see directly, but we are also responsible for delivering various technologies that allow you to implement various security controls. And that's one thing that we'll be talking about today, one group of these controls. Tomorrow I have a session about confidentiality and integrity protection, the innovation in this space, various crypto technologies, and also Ledger, which is a fairly cool and new thing within Azure SQL offerings. But the topic of today's conversation and today's sessions is authentication. What's the latest and greatest in the space of authentication in Azure SQL and SQL Server, including or primarily in SQL Server 2022. And then when we talk about innovation and authentication in Azure SQL, that practically means that it will be exclusively discussing and concentrating on Azure Active Directory authentication, because this is where all the innovation, all the investments over the last decade have been put into, not just within Azure databases, but at Microsoft in general. So that's the focus of our discussion and this presentation today, Azure Active Directory Authentication. We start with a quick recap on what it is and why use it, what challenges it's solving, and then the rest of it will be structured around the typical workflow for using Azure AD authentication with SQL products. So when you use it, you go through 3 steps, right? You set it up first, you enable it in your logical server or in your managed instance or in your SQL Server instance. Then you create SQL principles, logins, users, the map to Azure AD principles, and then your users of various kinds start connecting to your databases using Azure AD authentication, right? So that's the typical workflow. And as we go through these different tasks, typical use cases, we'll share with you what's new that applies to each of them, okay? So that's more or less is the plan. Does that sound more or less what you expected? Okay. Cool. So let's start with some context. So why Azure AD the authentication? What is it? Why Microsoft is investing in it? So when you look at various challenges that organizations face regarding identity management, and let me know if those challenges are applicable to you too. One of them is explosion of apps, resources, people authenticate to, right? That includes data assets like databases, database servers, and so on. The keyword that describes today's modern enterprise and other environments is hybrid, right? We have hybrid users connecting from their homes outside of the corp network to resources within the corporate network. Hybrid also means that organizations have resources scattered around their own data centers and various clouds. We have a growing number of identity attacks, evolving compliance regulations, and there is a growing demand for increased productivity. Right? That translates into specific authentication-specific requirements, like people want to sign in to various resources only once, right? Single sign-on. Or they want multi-factor authentication that is easy to use, right? So these are the challenges. Now, so you have these challenges on one side. On the other side, you have legacy authentication mechanisms that we had in databases in SQL in particular for many decades, right? And these legacy mechanisms are simply not sufficient. They do not help you address these challenges we talked about on the previous slide. So we have SQL authentication. So what's wrong with SQL authentication? So one thing that is very limiting is that when you use SQL authentication, each database, each server becomes its own identity provider, right? It's a silo, okay? So imagine you have 1,000 of databases or servers, right? Depending if you use contain database users or logins, right? And let's say you want to enforce certain password policies, or you want to provision access for a single user or a group of users to all these databases. It's a nightmare, right? You have to do that, the same task, probably 1,000 times, right? So that doesn't scale. Password-based authentication, which is what SQL authentication is about, also doesn't meet modern security and compliance standards. Then you have Windows authentication. It's more secure, but then it doesn't support today's hybrid scenarios, like users connecting to corp resources from machines that are not joined to a domain. Okay? So these are the challenges, and these authentication methods that we've had for decades do not really meet or address these challenges. Microsoft's answer to these modern challenges is Azure Active Directory. So it's a single, centralized, unified identity management system. It basically allows you to authenticate to anything from anywhere, right? You can authenticate to resources in your own network, in your own data center, to resources in Azure Cloud, with other clouds as well, from devices, various machines that are in the corpnet, outside of the corporate network, and so on. And it's critical for zero trust and compliance. In fact, many compliance regulations specifically call for a centralized, unified authentication identity management system, such as Azure Active Directory, right? A recap on some basic terminology that we will use throughout this presentation. So in Azure AD, we have three main different types of principles, right? We have user principles, typically used by human users, okay? And we have two types of service principles used by applications. One example, one type, one member of this category are managed identities, and they are used by Azure resources, applications running on Azure or Arc-enabled servers. And then we have application service principles that are used by applications running outside of the Azure ecosystem, okay? And now you can put these different types of principles into groups. You can create group hierarchies, which is a very useful mechanism, okay? Now, one challenge that Azure AD addresses very well today, one trend, one thing that you can observe in the industry, in the community, is that the world is moving away from passwords, right? Passwords are not sufficient anymore. How many of you use, maybe I should ask differently, how many of you use, let's say, multi-factor authentication when you authenticate to your work environment, right? Almost everybody, or everybody probably. World is moving away from passwords, and there is a desire and demand for passwordless authentication mechanisms. And Azure AD supports a multitude or several of these passwordless authentication mechanisms: multi-factor authentication for human users, managed identities. By definition, they support passwordless authentication, and we'll talk about them in details later on, and integrated authentication if you have domain joins machines on premises, and you have somehow integrated your Active Directory, let's say, with Azure Active Directory through various means that are available to you, like federation services, but there are simple mechanisms available now. You can also use integrated authentication, which doesn't require any secret or password management, okay? Now, as I said, Azure Active Directory is the authentication solution that Microsoft is and has been investing in for the last decade or so. That also applies to SQL products. We started this journey exactly about 10 years ago, and in 2015 or 16, we shipped the first version of Azure AD authentication, initially in Azure SQL Database, then Azure SQL MI shipped, and from its inception, it supported Azure AD authentication. That's what we started with. The biggest development of the last year or so is that now Azure Active Directory Authentication is available in SQL Server on Azure VMs and in SQL Server 22 on Arc-enabled machines, okay? So we kind of bringing the benefits of Azure AD authentication to SQL VMs and to SQL Server running outside of Azure Cloud as long as it's deployed in Arc-enabled environment, okay? Double-clicking on this, these new capabilities and this journey, again, as I said, the first two rows are about what is probably the most important, which is bringing Azure AD to SQL Server VMs and SQL Server on Arc, but we have also a bunch of at least four other new items we'll be demoing and talking about the details in the rest of the session. Ability to enforce Azure Active Directory Authentication and block SQL authentication completely, okay? That's available in the first two products, DB and MI. Automating user and logging provisioning for users and loggings that map to Azure AD principles. You will see what I mean by that exactly in a short demo I'll show you later. Logins for Azure AD principles. So far, we only supported users and contained users in per database principles rather than server level principles. Again, you'll see the benefit of that in a second. And Windows authentication for Azure AD principles in managed instance for easy lift and shift of legacy applications. Again, we'll talk about it in more details later on, okay? So this is a nutshell what we have delivered or shipped in the last year or so regarding authentication, okay? So now let's start, as I said, this presentation is structured, the rest of it at least around the three main steps for using the feature. The first step is you need to enable Azure AD authentication. By default, it's not enabled in various products. Let's start with how you do that in Azure SQL database, okay? Let's use this as a starting point. So the first step is you need to grant your Azure SQL server, logical server, access to Azure Active Directory so that it can read various information from it when it's processing authentication requests. Now, in the case of SQL DB, this is not required for most of the functionality, but to unlock the full functionality, and I will call it out specifically what it is later on, you have to make sure that your logical server in SQL DB has access to your Azure Active Directory. More precisely, it's a member of the Active Directory reader's role. And then you have to configure what is called Azure AD Administrator, right? That's a principal within the server that maps to a principal in Azure AD. That principal could be a group, doesn't have to be an individual user or application, which is, by the way, the recommended practice. And then optionally, you can say, actually, I don't want to use SQL authentication at all. For this logical server, I want to block it, right? So this is at a high level, the workflow for SQL DB. And now, for three other products, you'll see more or less a variation of the same, right? So for SQL MI, it's practically the same, except the first step is not optional. You won't be able to use Azure AD authentication in MI unless you grant that managed instance access to your Active Directory, right? That's absolutely required. For SQL VMs, that's actually slightly simplified. Some steps are kind of folded together. For SQL Server on Arc, on the other hand, this looks a little more complex, and it is more complex. And the reason behind it is that all the three products on the left, again, all these products need to be able to talk to Azure AD for at least for full functionality for in general to unlock the full functionality. And in some cases, it's absolutely required, right? And the three products on the left, they use managed identity, which are very easy to set up and use. And SQL Server on Arc, for various reasons, we couldn't use managed identities for SQL Server instance to communicate with Azure AD, which is why, which is the reasons, root cause behind this complexity that is exposed in this longer list and more complex steps. You basically have to provision an application principal instead of managed identity, and then make sure you also configure a certificate which is associated with that principal and deploy it to your managed instance. Now, we'll automate many of these steps for you. All you need to do is to provide an empty key vault and tools that we have built for SQL Server on Arc that will create a service principal, a cert for it, and it will deploy this cert to your instance automatically. But still, it's more complex than for the three products on the left, okay? In a nutshell, the logical steps are almost identical, okay? All right, so let me move to the first demo. And are we doing on time, okay? We're doing good. So in the first demo, this is what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you how to grant a logical server access. The demo is about SQL DB. So we'll grant a server access to Azure AD. This is needed again to unlock the full functionality in Azure SQL database. For Azure AD authentication, then we set up the Azure AD admin account. We map it to an Azure AD group. Then we'll verify that all the members of this group, who now should have become administrators of the server, can connect to it using Azure Active Directory authentication. Then we will block SQL authentication by enforcing or configuring what is called Azure AD authentication only. That's the official name of the feature. And then I also show you how to block creating servers, brand new servers, that allow SQL authentication by using Azure policies, okay? So that's the flow of the demo. Hopefully, I'm still connected to my demo VM here. And you can see Azure Portal. And in the Azure Portal, I'm showing you the overview page of the server that holds financial data for a fictitious company called Adatum. And right now, Azure Active Directory authentication is not enabled for that server. We'll get back to this page. When we'll be enabling Azure Active Directory authentication, you can see here that the SA, server administrator, of that server actually uses SQL authentication, can use SQL authentication, needs to use SQL authentication to connect to it. And actually, let me switch to SSMS here, SQL Server Management Studio, and let's see if that admin, when using this SQL login, can connect. They can connect here. We can see that, right? So this is the problem. This is the problem that we want to fix, right? We don't want admins, and in the future, nobody using this server, to use SQL authentication because of the benefits we talked about. We want them to use Azure AD authentication. So let's fix that, right? So let me disconnect from here. We'll come back to SSMS later. So now let's go through these three steps. So the first step, the first part of the first step is actually to check if my logical server in SQL DB has a managed identity, because not every server needs to have has it. This one does, so it's a system-assigned managed identity, okay? Now, I have it. The next thing I need to make sure is that that instance, that server, the managed identity of that server, is a member of the directory reader's role in my Active Directory, okay? So this is the first step. We need that to unlock the full functionality. There is specific new capability that we need, that requires that, okay? So that's the first step. Our logical server can access Azure AD. That is great, okay? The next step, we're gonna enable Azure AD in this instance by setting up an administrator account principal within the SQL Server process that maps to an Azure Active Directory principle. And that target Azure Active Directory principle can be of any type, right? It could be an individual human user, it could be an application, but the best practice is to use groups. This is a very, very powerful concept, a very powerful mechanism. When you use groups, when mapping SQL principles to Azure AD principles, then you can effectively control who is an administrator in this case by simply adding and removing users to and from that group. You can do that completely outside of the SQL environment, right? So it's very scalable and powerful. So let's save that. Now let me show you who's in that group, okay? So in that group, we have, the group name is ADatum DBAs. It has 3 members, and each member is a AD principle of a different kind, right? We have application service principle. Perhaps an application running outside of Azure is using it. Then we have human user, Adele, and we have finance VM, which is a managed identity of a certain VM, okay? So now we made this group an administrator. Let's see if these users now can connect to the server. And I use this as an opportunity to also introduce you to some changes in the connection dialog in SSMS 19 we have recently enabled. You can see quite a few options here. Some of them are new. I don't know if you saw them before. Let's start with this one. Azure Active Directory Universal Authentication with multi-factor authentication. I'm going to use that for that human user who is the member of that group, right? So let's see if that works. Yes, that worked. And there was, you may ask, okay, where's the MFA? I used this instance before to authenticate as Adele, and then I needed to go through the sign-in process. Now my token is cached, so I wasn't asked. That's the single sign-on idea, right? So Adele can connect. That's great. Let's look at some other options available in this drop now. Password. So this is password-based authentication for human users whose identities are present in Azure AD. Ideally, you should, not ideally, we recommend that you don't use this option. You avoid it, right? In general, you should avoid using passwords, right? MFA is a better option for that. Or you can use integrated authentication. If that user is connecting from a domain join machine, your Active Directory has been federated or integrated in another way in your Azure AD directory, okay? Now, I don't know if you saw that, Azure Active Directory Service Principle. So this is a new thing. It is essentially intended for DBAs to test if their applications that use application service principles can connect to their servers, right? So let's see if that is possible. I'm using here a client ID and a secret that is associated with that application service principle that is part of the DBA group, okay? That application can connect. That's great. Let's try one more thing. Manage identity, the same purpose. So this SQL Server Management Studio instance is running on a VM. The managed identity of that VM is a member of the DBA group. So it should be able to connect. And the beauty of using managed identity is there's nothing else you need to specify other than saying, I want to connect using managed identity. And we'll come back to that later, okay? So that managed identity can also connect. Super. So let's disconnect here, and so this is great. These 3 users can connect, so life is good, but I want to bring it to the next level. I actually want to block SQL authentication, okay? I love Azure AD so much that I want to now disallow SQL authentication. So that can be easily done with actually 2 clicks or 3 clicks. So you select this checkbox and you click Save. And now if we go back to SSMS and do what we did as one of the first steps in this demo, which is trying to connect using this DBA login, let's see what happens, okay? So you get this. Login failed, Azure Active Authentication only is enabled, okay? SQL authentication not allowed anymore, okay? Now, let's go one step further. So I solved this problem, enable AD authentication, disable SQL authentication for one server, okay? let me show you something here. I have a resource group. It's called ADatum Sales. I know that at some point, developers and DBAs from the sales organization are going to create a bunch of servers and databases in this group. I want to make sure that these servers will only allow SQL authentication. So I can enforce it using Azure policies. Let me show you how to do that. So I go policies here, to policies here. I'm not going to create a new policy because it takes about 10 to 15 minutes for it to take effect. So I created it before the demo. Let me show it to you. So I created this policy using the pre-existing policy definition that its name, Azure SQL DB should have Azure Active Directory only authentication enabled. Okay. In parameters, I configure the effect of this policy. I set it to deny, which means that creating a new server which doesn't meet this policy is going to be blocked. So let's actually see if it's blocked by attempting to create a new server in the sales group which uses SQL authentication. So let me try to move forward with that. And that is expected to fail. I guess one more click. OK, it happened already. So that failed. And it failed because the policy doesn't allow it, right? So to summarize, I showed you how to configure Azure AD in a specific server, how to enforce SQL authentication. We connected in 3 different ways using Azure AD, and then I showed you how to block it using Azure policies for future servers. By the way, that policy could be created at the resource group level or subscription level, right? All right, let's go back to the presentation. Moving to the next step in the workflow of using Azure AD authentication, right? So we enabled Azure AD in a server, right? Which means that now administrators can connect to that server using Azure AD authentication. That is great, but not everybody is an admin, hopefully, right? We have low privilege users. So to allow these low privilege users to connect using Azure AD, we need to create logins or users, in other words, SQL principles, and map them to Azure AD principles. And this complex diagram shows you different combinations that are supported, right? So you can create a contained database user, database level principle for a group, a human user, managed identity, or an application service principle, and you can do the same with logins. By the way, logins are new, right? That's a new thing. Creating server-level principles were not supported until recently. What is, of course, if you have 10,000 users or 200,000 users in your organization, right, you don't need to create 200,000 logins for them in your databases. Actually, you should not. Instead, you should heavily leverage groups, right? So ideally, you should be using mapping SQL principles to groups. And on the left-hand side, we recommend that you use logins because to improve scalability and your efficiency, right? Instead of creating a contained database users in 100 databases in your server, you can create one login at the server level. So that's easier, right? Now, how you do that? Go ahead.
There's a question from online audience. Can Azure Active Directory be used on SQL Server 2020 to running on-prem with Azure extension enabled?
Right. So the question is, can Azure AD authentication be used on-prem with on SQL Server 22 with Azure extension enabled? For me, at least, the term Azure extension is not completely clear and understood. What I can answer this question is that absolutely SQL Server can be used with Azure AD authentication on premises as long as it is running on Arc-enabled machine. right? So I'm not sure, I'm not super familiar with Arc. I'm not sure if this term extension is the concept in Arc, but that is what you need to do to use Azure AD with SQL Server 2022 on premises. You need to make sure that it's running on Arc environment, so that machine is integrated with Azure. Okay? If there is any follow-up, Hubert, let me know, okay? Go ahead.
Regarding this, I also read about an AD in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean also I need, for every machine which we use AD authentication, I also need a license, an ARC license for the SQL server itself?
That you definitely need a SQL license I would say so, but I'm not sure about the ARC licensing scheme. I just don't know anything about it, but I can find out.
They must be registered, the machines in ARC itself, or in Azure ARC itself, isn't it?
Yes, each machine needs to be registered in Azure, which is what an ARC enabling that machine involves. And in addition, you, of course, will want to, well, what's, I guess, assumed in the scenario that SQL Server is running on that ARC-enabled machine, of course, you need to have a license for that server instance too. We can take this offline, and if you want, you can give me your contact information. I can follow up with and try to find out the more precise answer, as I'm not sure I'm answering it, as I'm not truly ARC expert here. Okay. Now, this is how you do that from the T-SQL syntax standpoint. This is how you create server-level principles or database-level principles, the map to Azure AD principles. What's highlighted here is, in general, the recommended practice, creating logins for groups, right? So, yep, best practice, use logins rather than users, and use Azure AD groups. And one more piece of best practice, automate user and login provisioning, right? Do not run or author your create user statements by hand. You know, it's error prone, of course, right? Obvious things, right? So it's better to automate it, which you can do by using a tool, or writing or developing your own tool, or writing a script and running a job that does this that automates this, the provisioning of logins or users or both, that map to Azure AD principles, and that's what this next demo is about. Go ahead.
It might be premature. I was going to ask, are there any GitHub repos that support those automations?
Can you repeat the question? I will repeat it too. Are there any GitHub repos that support automation? I'm not aware of that, but again, I can try to follow up and get the answer for you. I'm sure there are open source, I would guess there are open source tools that do that. If anybody knows the answer, please feel free to chime in. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do in this demo. On a virtual machine, okay, that is a member of the Azure AD admin group, the same VM I ran SSMS before from, right? On this machine, we will run a PowerShell script. And that PowerShell script will connect to the server using managed identity of that VM, and it will create a login for an Azure AD principal, which will be the group, right? And I could actually stop the demo here because that's the essence of it, right? So what was not possible until recently was creating logins or users by service principals. You needed to be a human user, right? Which kind of was completely breaking or interfering with the idea of automation, where typically a job, an application that runs and creates users or logins would ideally use managed identity or service principles. So that wasn't possible before. It is possible now. So let me show you that quickly. That's a super quick demo. So here I have visual code with a PowerShell script. Again, you can do that in 100 different ways. You can write your own application possibly you can find a third-party tool or a tool written by somebody else, published on GitHub, maybe even by us, Microsoft, but I'm not aware of that, that does this, right? So here are the steps of my demo. First, I'm going to connect, so not me, this virtual machine using its own managed identity is going to connect to the server. It's an admin, it's an administrator, it's a member of the admin group, remember, okay? And now we're gonna use invoke SQL CMD commandlet to create a login server level principal that maps to the analysts, ADatum analyst group again. It's a fictitious situation, right? And again, that's the essence of the demo. That's the core of it. I can do that in an automated way now using using a service principal, which could be managed identity, or a service or an application service principal. Okay? Does that make sense? As I said, it's a super short demo. Let's go back to the slides and let's move on to the last part, which is about connecting to a database using Azure AD authentication. So now we provisioned these shadow principals, logins users, they map to Azure AD. Our users can now start connecting to the database. Now, I already showed you how to do that in SSMS, right? And it's very similar in other tools. In this section, I will focus on developer's perspective, okay? So I will be using C# examples and SQL client driver under the covers, but the same concepts, very similar syntax even, applies to other drivers and other environments, okay? I'll start, so first of all, when you, to enable Azure AD authentication in your application, you need to use a specific connection string syntax, a specific connection string keyword. It's called authentication in all the drivers, I think. And it can have one of the many values. And each of these values prescribes a specific authentication workflow that you want your client driver in this app to use, okay? So I'm starting with authentication mechanisms or workflows that in general should be avoided. So avoid them if you can, right? In the first case, you usually can. And the first example is about using password authentication for Azure AD principles. Avoid it. There are other choices, you already know them, but we'll reiterate them on the next slide, right? The second one may be hard to avoid. So if your application is running outside of Azure, then really the only option is to use application service principal. And it's easiest to pass a secret, right? In the connection string or in the application. You can use a certificate. It's better, it's substantially better. It doesn't address the security issue because you still have a private key from the certificate exposed in your process. But yeah, again, if your app is running outside of Azure, you might not have a choice. If it's running in Azure, managed identity is a much better choice, and we'll talk about it next. Again, what you see here probably represent the worst case example, which is you have a connection string with the password or secret hard-coded in your code, right? Let's say you check this in your system, in your version control system, version management system. It's going to be persisted there forever, right? You don't want that. You can use, a config file. It makes things somewhat better, but still, these two should be avoided. Managed identity. Again, the beauty of it is that you don't have to specify anything unless you use user managed identity, then you specify user ID, but no secret. Let's kind of look under the covers to demystify this mechanism. So from the application point of view, it's super simple. All the complexity is hidden under the covers. So what happens if the client calls, okay, open a connection, and here's the connection string in which I said I want to use manage identity. What will happen? The client driver will silently talk to something that is called Azure Instance Metadata Service. It's a runtime running in the host OS on a VM, on a machine that hosts the VM, right? And this runtime hides all the complexity. So under the covers, it manages credentials for managed instance. But you don't have to worry about it. These credentials are magically and transparently managed, rotated for you. What happens is this runtime redeems these credentials for a token, passes this token to the client driver, and the client driver simply uses it to connect to the database. Super simple from the application's point of view, right? All the complexity is hidden below. No secret is exposed to the application code, okay? Let's look at another mechanism, integrated Windows authentication. So this is about connecting from a domain join machine, which has been with an on-prem Active Directory domain, which has been integrated with Azure Active Directory. So in this case, Kerberos token is redeemed for an AD token in the handshake with Azure AD. Okay, again, no password. Two other methods are for human users. One of them is called interactive flow, and the other is called device code flow. And the easiest way to explain them is by using the demo. So I have another super quick demo that I wanted to show you. And I have a very simple application here, and I'm running a debugger. It connects to the database twice, once using multi-factor authentication, so-called Active Directory interactive workflow. So let me step through this, and you will see what happens when the application reaches this open, invokes this open method, right? So what it does, it opens basically a web browser window, prompting you, a user, to authenticate. This is essentially what happens under the covers when you use universal MFA in SQL Server Management Studio. That's exactly what it is, right? So let's authenticate here as Adele. That succeed. Let's go to the next part of this super simple application, which uses the mechanism called Active Directory Device Code Flow. Let me show you what it does, and it's a fairly new thing. So let me step through this. When this application hits open, the driver outputs the following message on the console, okay? It basically says, go to this website and enter this code. Okay? And this is intended to be used for devices that have no UI or that do not support inputting any information through the UI, such as perhaps smart TVs. Okay? So let's actually complete this. Let's go to this place. And here I'm prompted to enter this code. So let me copy it. Okay. And now, so I'm doing this from, the assumption is that I'm doing this from a device that has a UI, like my phone perhaps, right? So my smart TV is telling me, okay, you need to authenticate. Here is where you should go on your other device, your tablet, phone, or computer. And so let's finish this, and this informs me that this connection happens on behalf of SQL client driver library, okay? As simple as that. One more thing, and we will wrap up. So that was our demo. There is one more new method, new and old at the same time, that I want to tell you about, and that's really exciting. But it's also very specific enhancement. This enhancement, for now at least, targets managed instance and customers who move legacy applications to managed instance. We believe that managed instance is the best place for migrating in an easy way existing applications to Azure. And one problem that many customers struggle with is that their apps on premises use old-fashioned Windows authentication called integrated authentication using on-prem Active Directory. So they have apps maybe written 20 years ago or older using old versions of client drivers, and they don't own the source code of these applications. Maybe they are written by third parties. They cannot modify the connection string, and they definitely cannot replace the client driver in those apps, right? So, and they would love to move to managed instance. They would love to move the database that this application uses to managed instance, okay? So the connection string in their app, it looks like this. It contains integrated security equals true, which under the covers triggers traditional Kerberos authentication using Active Directory, right? So the goal is to enable such customers to move the database to the cloud. The only thing the customer needs to change is to repoint their app to the new location, which is now in managed instance, and that's it. No need to update the client driver, no need to change the value of this property, which only is available in new client drivers, right? So that's what we enabled. That there is lots of literature on how we did that exactly and how to set it up. It's somewhat involving, but I just wanted to let you know about the value prop of it, which is key. All right, so let's move to a wrap up, and then we'll have some time for questions, and I'm happy to stay around and answer questions after the session also. So if I were to leave you with key takeaways, number one is Azure AD is a unified, centralized identity system, which is intended to simplify governance. It's critical for zero trust and compliance, as we discussed. Use passwordless authentication methods whenever possible. World is moving away from passwords. And as far as new developments, again, the most substantial one, I want to again reiterate the answer to that question we got. Azure AD is very much supported in SQL Server 2022. It requires, however, Arc-enabled environment, and it's supported in Azure VMs. That I would say is the greatest development of the last year or so. And there are 4 at least other enhancements: ability to enforce SQL authentication. Azure AD authentication and block SQL authentication, and currently available in MI and DB. Automated user provisioning using managed identities and application service principles. Logins associated with Azure AD principles for better scalability and efficiency. You don't have to create users in each database now. And Windows authentication for easy lift and shift or existing on-prem legacy application from SQL Server on premises to Azure. Minimal code changes required. That's the last topic we talked about. One more thing I want to call out, I have only one link for you. We're actually quite proud of it. We created this landing page. It's very new, like literally a week or two. So this is the place which captures all the resources about Azure AD authentication for SQL products all in one place. That's why I only have one link here. So with that, I'm happy to use any remaining time. Probably we don't have too much of it here to answer any questions, and we can also, I'm happy to stay off on after the session. And I do want to make sure that you feel empowered to email me with any follow-up questions. Here's my email address. I completely don't mind, actually. I'd love to hear from you. Any questions you might have. And I have another session tomorrow. Remember that if that interests you. Okay, thanks.